The Middle East just handed Europe an energy bill it never agreed to pay. A coordinated drone strike on Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial complex, the single largest liquefied natural gas export hub on the planet, knocked out roughly a fifth of global LNG supply overnight. European gas futures didn't just rise. They convulsed, nearly 50% in one trading session. Goldman Sachs followed with a projection that should be framing every conversation right now. If the Strait of Hormuz stays functionally closed for just 30 days, European gas prices could surge by 130%. That's not volatility. That is a structural rupture in the energy architecture that has quietly powered European industry for 4 decades. And here's what makes this genuinely extraordinary. The country whose military action triggered this chain of events, the United States, is now positioning itself as the solution, offering to escort energy tankers through a waterway its own strikes effectively shut down. I'm going to walk you through why that contradiction matters enormously, and why Europe, despite absorbing the immediate hit, is holding stronger long-term cards than it looks right now. I study data patterns at the intersection of geopolitics, energy, and economics. What I'm seeing isn't just a crisis. It's a compression of forces that Europe has been building toward, slowly, painfully, sometimes reluctantly, for 3 decades. The shock is real, but the trajectory it unlocks is something else entirely. Let's establish the actual sequence of events, because the timeline is the story. Late February, U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. Within 72 hours, Iranian drones hit Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the complex feeding roughly 20% of global LNG export capacity. Qatar LNG suspends all operations. Simultaneously, Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery, moving 550,000 barrels per day, shuts as a precaution. JP Morgan's energy desk issues a stark 25-day warning. If Hormuz stays disrupted that long, storage fills, producers cut output, and shortfalls become self-reinforcing. Prices don't just spike. They restructure upward until a painful new equilibrium forms. A conflict that began over Iran's nuclear program has now embedded itself directly into European household heating costs and industrial energy contracts. That is the chain, and each link in it is load-bearing. Here's what makes Europe's current position more complicated than simply "this is bad." EU gas storage going into this shock was already lean, sitting around 30% capacity across the bloc. Germany, Europe's industrial core, was at just 21.6% at the end of February. France was in the low 20s. These are uncomfortable numbers with no margin for error. There is no cushion to absorb a prolonged disruption without households and factories feeling it sharply. Higher bills are coming for consumers. Industrial energy costs are climbing in sectors already under serious margin pressure. That pain is real, and I'm not going to minimize it. But pattern recognition requires looking beyond the immediate data point to what the data point actually forces. In 2022, when Russia weaponized pipeline gas following the Ukraine invasion, the consensus among analysts was grim and near universal. European industry couldn't survive the transition. German manufacturing would hollow out, and deindustrialization was essentially inevitable. The models were confident. The headlines were relentless and consistent. And then something unexpected happened. Europe didn't collapse. It restructured faster than any model had predicted. LNG import terminals that hadn't existed were built at emergency pace. Renewable energy deployment accelerated across the continent. Pipeline dependencies were rerouted and reduced. The political will that had been blocked for years by incumbent energy interests suddenly had nowhere left to hide. The 2022 shock accomplished something that years of climate policy had repeatedly failed to do. It made energy independence an urgent national security priority rather than a long-term environmental aspiration. This is round 2. And critically, Europe is not starting from zero this time. The LNG import terminals are already running. The cross-border grid interconnectors are stronger and more integrated than 3 years ago. The political consensus that energy sovereignty is non-negotiable, the consensus that took 2 full generations to build, is now structurally embedded in European institutional thinking at every level. Every minister, every energy regulator, and every industrial board across the continent is currently running accelerated scenarios for what full domestic generation capacity would actually require. That capital is not sitting in planning committees anymore. It is about to move, and the direction it moves is no longer seriously in question. Goldman Sachs numbers clarify exactly why the economics have shifted so decisively. At $25 per million BTU, the projected price ceiling under a sustained 1-month Hormuz disruption, the financial case for domestic renewables, battery storage, grid modernization, and heat pump infrastructure doesn't improve slightly, it becomes unambiguous and unavoidable. Every project that was borderline viable at $11 per MMBTU becomes not just viable, but obviously necessary at 25. The math rewrites itself completely, and with it rewrites the political calculus in every European capital simultaneously. There's also a critical detail buried in Goldman's note that most media coverage moves straight past. U.S. LNG export terminals were already running at 94% utilization before this crisis began. There is effectively no meaningful surge capacity sitting idle. The United States physically cannot rescue Europe with a flood of cheap gas because the infrastructure ceiling is already hit. This isn't a political choice or a negotiating position. It is a hard physical constraint that no amount of diplomatic pressure can overcome, which means Europe's only durable answer is precisely the one it already knew it needed: domestic generation at scale, pursued with genuine urgency. This crisis didn't create that answer. It removed the last serious political obstacle to funding it properly and immediately before another shock arrives. Now look at where the United States actually stands in all of this. American LNG exporters are posting gains. Cheniere up 6%. Venture Global up over 14%. The marginal supply they can offer now commands dramatically higher spot prices, so that narrow slice of the U.S. energy sector benefits in the short term. But the broader American economy is absorbing an inflationary energy shock at exactly the moment when the Federal Reserve has no clean policy response available. Cut rates to protect growth and inflation spirals further. Hold rates to contain inflation and growth stays fully exposed. The toolkit is constrained on both ends simultaneously, which is the textbook definition of a stagflationary trap with no obvious exit. Hundreds of billions were erased from U.S. equity markets within days of the strike's beginning. The geopolitical costs compound this. France was not consulted before the strikes launched. Spain denied base access. The UK kept its support deliberately limited. These are not minor diplomatic frictions. They represent a durable fracture in the alliance architecture the United States has depended on since 1945. The U.S. initiated military action that closed the world's most critical energy corridor, created inflationary pressure feeding directly into American consumer prices, and fractured relationships with its closest partners, while the primary financial beneficiaries are a handful of LNG export companies. That is not a sustainable strategic position. Here's where the data points over the next 12 to 18 months. First, EU energy infrastructure investment accelerates at a pace that would have seemed politically impossible 2 years ago. The political will just arrive, painfully, but conclusively, and without ambiguity. Second, a wave of renewable energy supply partnerships, particularly in solar, offshore wind, and grid-scale battery storage, as European industry locks in domestic price stability contracts that eliminate exposure to the next shock. Third, a widening and increasingly visible divergence between European and American economic trajectories. Europe restructuring aggressively toward independence, while the U.S. manages inflation it cannot fully control and absorbs the open-ended cost of an unresolved conflict. Energy crises do not reward comfort. They reward speed of adaptation. The economies that emerge stronger are never the ones with the easiest starting position. They are the ones that translate shock into structural change faster than anyone expected. Europe has done this before. The data, right now, says it is about to do it again.